Crazy landlord. The landlord had done whatever he wanted for too long, so I ended up getting 9 months of free living. This story is going to be quite long because it needs context. I will add plenty of details to make everything clearer. Some minor details might not be perfectly accurate because I have no desire to revive this conflict in any way. I won it completely, and returning to it would only spoil the taste of victory. To begin with, I spent about 20 years working in the security field. During that time, I did various types of security in many different places. For this story, what matters is that for a while, I worked at a residential tenancy tribunal in a major city in a role that was, roughly speaking, a court bailiff. For those who don't know what that is, imagine a courtroom in a big city. In a small town, it would likely be a conference room in a hotel or community center. Like on TV, but with less formality and with an arbitrator instead of a judge. Effectively, for landlords and tenants, it's the same thing, but legally it's quite different. This institution deals exclusively with disputes between landlords and tenants and is the only place where such disputes are resolved. I should note that I wasn't a bailiff and it wasn't a court, but these terms accurately describe the situation and my role in it. I worked at this tribunal for 2 years at the very beginning of my security career. I was about 18 to 20 years old. Since it was a major city, the number of cases I attended is impossible to count. I saw everything. It is impossible to surprise me with any story because I've seen it all, and in detail, since one of my duties was to ensure all parties had copies of all evidence presented. I made an endless number of photocopies and always read and checked everything I copied to ensure nothing was cut off or unreadable. By the time I stopped working there, I knew how everything worked well enough to be an arbitrator myself. Well, obviously not, but I certainly didn't need a lawyer if I ever had to go to the tribunal. I also perfectly understood how the system worked outside of the formal rules. For example, arbitrators always gave a bit of leeway to those representing themselves compared to those who had a lawyer. Or how angry arbitrators get when a party speaks out of turn. Seriously, never do that. And so, 10 years passed. I moved away from that metropolis and lived in a fairly large city in the same province with the same rental laws. I was renting a spacious townhouse with several roommates. We got along great. But there was a problem. I was the only one who could write checks. Our paydays didn't align. Therefore, I was the one who paid the rent. And usually, I couldn't do it on the first of the month because the roommates didn't always manage to chip in on time. We warned the landlord that we might be a day or two late, but the money would always be there by the 3rd at the latest. He had no problem with this. I discussed it with him personally. Everything was fine for about a year. There were no complaints from the landlord because even if we were often late by a day or two, we always paid. We were also quite quiet and didn't damage the property. Almost model tenants. For some reason, at one point, everything changed. I don't know the exact reason, but I suspect the company simply changed the person responsible for our region. One day, suddenly, on the 2nd day of the month, we received a summons to the Residential Tenancy Tribunal, hereafter RTT, for non-payment of rent. It didn't reach a hearing because we paid that same day. Well, now we had to reimburse the filing fee the landlord paid to issue the summons. I complained to a neighbor who was also a manager and eventually found out that their contact in the company now demanded payment strictly on the 1st, without exceptions. For us, this wasn't an option at all, so over the next 2 years, we probably had to pay that fee 15 to 20 times. I could have gone to the tribunal, but technically we were in the wrong, and I knew that. Maybe if I had gone there enough times, I could have nailed them for harassment, but I didn't have time for that, and the roommates didn't care. Once the fee was split among everyone, it wasn't a big enough hit to the pocket to change our behavior, so we just accepted it as a given. If that had been the only problem, there would be no story. Around the same time the leeway on payment deadlines disappeared, the mandatory maintenance vanished as well. I won't even list everything that broke and wasn't fixed. By the end, you'll have a good idea anyway. We put up with it. We all worked too many hours for crap pay to really do anything about it. We adapted. But about 2 years later, the system broke. Everyone except me moved out for various reasons within 4 months. I won't go into details about the roommates because their situation isn't related to this story. I had saved some money and was able to quit my job without immediately looking for a new one, so I suddenly had a lot of free time. I didn't want to stay and pay the rent alone or look for new roommates to live with. And given my experience at the RTT, I knew I had the landlord by the balls. So, I went on the offensive. I stopped paying rent. My indignation knew no bounds because in the first month, no summons arrived. But in the second month, it did. I went to the RTT. I came prepared with a documented pile of evidence that the property was not being maintained and that the landlord was entering the residence without official notice. I had a copy for the landlord and a copy for the arbitrator. I knew from experience that formally, evidence should be shared with the other side before the hearing. But I also knew about that same leeway the arbitrator gives to self-represented parties. So, I didn't give the landlord the evidence before the hearing started. A 100% pure ambush. They claimed they were caught off guard, but the arbitrator just dismissed the case, gave me a slight scolding, and told me to file my own summons, as I should have done initially. It was a petty revenge. The landlord and his lawyer drove 3 hours for nothing. Worse than nothing. I filed my own summons, and the day X arrived. By this point, I hadn't paid rent for about 4 months. I was ready to pay if I lost, but I didn't think I would lose. Everything went perfectly. I had 20 to 30 pages of evidence and about 20 photographs. They had nothing. They had no real defense regarding why the water heater hadn't worked for 6 months or why there had been no refrigerator for a whole year. Not to mention other serious problems. Their entire defense was based on the fact that we were late with rent payments, but this backfired when the arbitrator found out how many times we had paid the filing fee, and also when their lies, unsupported by any evidence, were exposed. They even interrupted me several times, and at the only moment I opened my mouth to object during their presentation, I used my willpower to force myself to shut up so that only a squeak escaped. I saw in his eyes that the arbitrator respected me for that. He had no respect for the landlord. I won on every possible point. It was only a matter of the amount. It was more than I had ever seen. I was awarded 9 months of free rent, and the landlord was ordered to fix all the problems in the residence by the end of the next month, or else I would get even more months of free rent. I gave notice to vacate at the end of the 8th month and moved out at the end of the 9th. Since the landlord never renewed the lease, I had to comply with the 3-month notice period specified in it. If you want a concrete figure, I effectively received a court judgment in my favor for about $13,000, adjusting for inflation and rounding. I also made the landlord and his lawyer drive 3 hours twice, only to lose in the end. By the end, the landlord's face was so red I thought he might have a heart attack. I also want to add for the good landlords out there, I understand you. My time at the RTT opened my eyes. For every one bad landlord, there are easily 10 bad tenants. One could argue about this forever, but I'll just say that I empathize with the good landlords. I'm not trying to portray all landlords as terrible. This was the only landlord in my life who was this useless.